Hello and welcome to FinTech Talk. Today we're looking at open banking. Open banking is a concept that is about a decade old, but it still feels like it's still finding its feet. And there's tremendous interest in what we can learn from other countries, what new technologies are coming, and how we can really maximize the potential of an open finance ecosystem. Well, the FinTech Talk formula is always to introduce you to the world's leading experts on any subject. And I'm delighted today to announce that we have the two world's leading experts in open banking. So we're going to be asking them about the technologies at work, about what we can learn from other countries. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel today. And our first guest is Craig Greenhouse, the founder of Open Data Consult, a specialist advisory which helps banks and fintechs develop open banking and embedded finance solutions. Craig has been around since, well, I'm not going to say since really the inception of open banking ecosystems. He's an expert in OAuth, in FAPI, and in digital trust frameworks. Craig, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Charles. Good to be here.
Fantastic. And joining us is Lauren Jones. Lauren is open banking lead at consultancy Payloom. Lauren, again, has 15 years experience in banking, payment solutions, and is an expert in every aspect of open banking and embedded finance. So, Lauren, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Charles. Great to be here.
Well, let's dive in. Craig, just give us an overview. I mean, I said that open banking and open ecosystems still feel like they're still sort of fulfilling their potential. Craig, how do you see it? Where are we at the moment with open banking?
So, well, it started in the UK and Europe. It started with the CMA 9 being mandated to basically share customer data securely. It's one of those things where you've got standards and you've got uptake. So in terms of standards, the UK and the European standards are actually pretty strict, but the uptake is pretty low. We've got about 9 million people in the UK that regularly use open banking. More in Northern Europe than Southern Europe. It's now gone across the world as well. So the rest of the world followed. Brazil was next. Then we had Australia in about 2020. And the North Americans are still not quite sure what they're doing with the 1033 decision being sort of made and then ratified and then sort of legally challenged. Then will they, won't they? Canada's been mandated for 2026. But in terms of uptake, I think Brazil's probably the poster child for the best thing. They've got 150 million users using
Gosh.
open banking and Pix. And it's now expanded to open finance, which also includes credit as well. So, yeah, it is gradually getting a bigger uptake, but it's still not everyone knows of its existence. But to move to the embedded finance, it's an enabler for embedded finance, but it's not the only game in town. That's my take on it so far.
That's a great overview. Okay, so yeah, couldn't be better to as a subject for an episode of FinTech Talk then.
Yeah.
Lauren, I mean, in the UK, we tend to be a bit introspective, borderline narcissistic. You know, we assume we're cutting edge, but what's going on in the rest of the world when it comes to open banking and open finance ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember as well, despite, the UK often being touted as the start of open banking and the open banking phenomenon, 10 years ago nearly now, we've had open banking in various different forms for probably about 20 plus years, really. I mean, the US, has had a form of open banking very successfully for at least 20 years. What we really mean in this kind of modern terminology is, largely regulated, largely API driven, safe and secure data sharing, which is where the UK really was at the vanguard and continues to be. I mean, I think, we've seen various statistics, but we're looking at about 80, 85 countries now, either live or in development with various open banking or open finance programs. So that's a significant portion of the world. Most of the major markets either are in development or, as Craig rightly put, the Canadians of this world really come struggling and grappling with what that looks like from a local perspective. But I think what we're starting to see now actually is also some themes emerging in terms of those implementation options. I think it's, the narcissistic term is quite right, Charles, there, where the UK thinks that how we did it was the right way and everyone must do it this way. I think what we're seeing now is, yes, there are some themes emerge in terms of best practice when it comes to implementing open banking, but there is, clear divergence based on quite legitimate local and regional norms. So I think, yes, good to take stock. The international kind of community is moving along, quickly behind the UK in some respects, doing significantly better than the UK. And there are some themes emerging that I think now the UK can look at in terms of best practice and start to perhaps adjust course.
Great. That's a fantastic overview. Yeah, I love this idea of British people being more open to the outside world, not just in this area, but
Would be
so
nice.
many areas. Because clearly, the great innovation. Craig, you say, Brazil, clearly a world leader in this, as they are in so many industries, aerospace and stuff like that. But just tell us about the essential vision of open banking. What is the core philosophy of it? And maybe just try and include that why we've struggled to live up to that the dream of what it was going to be.
Shall I take that one initially?
Craig, absolutely.
So the vision is basically giving control of data and consent to the user, whereas previously banking apps were using screen scraping technologies. There was a lot of sort of disparate different APIs and things. The whole idea of open banking is right. You as the user, you control your data. You can allow it to be shared in various ways with various people. And also from the other side, from the bank side, it's a case of standards, high security standards that all the banks have to adapt to. So it's really a case of end to end. The users can control who allows their data to be accessed, and the banks have a set of standard to allow that to be done in a standard way. That's my short take on it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, and again, to bring this international flavour, obviously the UK was very much a competition remedy, right? It was to lower the barriers to entry for other, entrants to come in and compete for, access to providing financial services to customers. There wasn't just a single front door for customers to access financial services, and obviously that was through the CMA, as Craig rightly said. I think where we're seeing in other markets is it's not necessarily always driven by a kind of competition remedy or a competition agenda. There's lots of kind of innovation agendas at place. The EU, it started off as a security requirement, basically saying, we're tired of this screen scraping nonsense. We really want to implement an API-based ecosystem for secure data sharing. So I think there's quite a different set of themes in terms of why individual countries try and undertake an open banking agenda, which means they might then make different implementation choices based on the outcomes and the objectives that they're trying to achieve. Like I said, the UK being very competition focused, in lots of parts of the world now, particularly the global south, we're seeing financial inclusion being one of the biggest reasons why they undertake open banking. So the reasons why they do it will also then affect the downstream implementation choices that they may make.
Sure. I'd like to ask you both about your favorite use cases. I mean, when open banking launched, there were some quite fun apps that, put all your account aggregators, but that seemed like a, bit underwhelming. Fun,
Very.
useful, but not really pushing it to its potential. Lauren, what have you seen
There's
in
quite a
terms
lot
of
of
deployment?
interesting ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the app one. I've seen a couple of very good apps in Asia Pacific, particularly in Singapore, that have used kind of open banking functionality, but it's part of a much bigger, app strategy, if you like, where it includes things like AI and robotics and data analytics and all that kind of stuff. But if we're talking about pure open banking, one of my favorites, and it's a bit nerdy because it is really kind of like kind of probably more industry focused, but so the International Air Traffic Association, which it can count the largest airlines in the world, Emirates, Cathay Pacific, amongst its members, were essentially tasked by the big airlines to say, "Oh, we've heard about this open banking. We're getting really squeezed on the card scheme fees during COVID and the pandemic, etc. Can you come up with an alternative?" And so they had or still do have a very forward-thinking head of payments over there who essentially said, yes, we're going to create a white label open banking payment solution for you to issue your tickets. And Emirates now, if you're using Emirates but buying an online ticket in the UK, chances are the top one will be open banking or pay by bank or Emirates Pay as they call it. And this is changing the way the airlines are able to ticket and issue payments, but also it has enabled, actually more interestingly, a bank to be the third party payment provider. So we always consider TPPs to be fintechs. Actually, in this scenario, given obviously the industrial use case, the airlines wanted a bank to act as the TPP. So actually, it enabled Deutsche Bank, who isn't traditionally a merchant acquirer, to enter a completely new space for them to get into the online payments business. So I think and I think it's really going to be these big industrial use cases that move the dial. It's great, and I love what the fintechs do, and it's fantastic from a grassroots level. But it's going to take some of these big industrial use cases where customers start to become well used or well accustomed, like they are with card payments, to really kind of move the dial, I think, with open banking, particularly in the payment space.
That's a great example. Craig, I'll put that to you. What have you seen that really excited you?
So I think for me, it's changed over time actually. It's gone from very nerdy to a bit nerdy to not nerdy at all. So initially, I was very excited about the concept of account aggregation.
Hmm.
And I did actually kind of build a couple of prototype apps that did that myself just for fun. But then as time went on, actually, I actually discovered that a lot of the online accounting packages, such as QuickBooks and Xero, were using open banking for getting feeds in as well. Wow, and no need to download spreadsheets or PDFs and upload them anymore. Yes, I can enable these apps to use my bank accounts with open banking without having to do that. So that was my not quite so nerdy one. But I think for me now, seeing the whole ecosystem of embedded finance apps happening, but obviously also with the rise of AI, the fact that you've now got AI financial concierges that can do things between different embedded finance apps or even the super app type thing. I think if that using open banking as the payment and account access rails for me is the most exciting new development that's coming down the track.
That's great. And something I'm interested in is how open financial systems are being used for embedded finance, because I have a vested interest here. I write on the side for the Open and Embedded Insurance Observatory, which writes industry reports, for example, the automotive sector. And they're incredibly excited by the idea of embedded finance because someone can go in to buy a car, a new car. Now, previously, they'd have to search for insurance, buy insurance, and it holds it up for hours, maybe even days. Whereas with embedded finance, they can tag insurance on at the end of the purchasing process, and someone's out of there in 5 minutes already using the data that the OEM has collected along the way. So it really does change your user experience. That's great. So again, Craig, I mean, do we think of embedded finance as a subsection of open banking these days? How do they relate to each other?
I think it's a super section, really. So open banking is
Okay.
one of the various enablers of embedded finance. There are
Okay.
others as well, such as banks as a service, debit and credit cards that you can get, various other payment rails and things. But for me, the open banking side of things enables the embedded finance because you can push payments, you can get account information and such like. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lauren, I'll put that to you as well. How do you see the relationship between embedded finance and open finance?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Craig on that. I think open finance is a subset of embedded finance. I think open finance alone is not going to make for necessarily the best embedded finance experience. It's just a part of it. And like I say, some of the best use cases I've seen around that have included other things like AI and, really enhanced and sophisticated data analytics. I think we're seeing. I think the use of open finance in earnest in the embedded finance space is slow, I would say. But we are seeing it, and I think we've seen it particularly in the credit space, probably the most significantly with Experian a few years ago now. I think made a fairly big press announcement about it enhancing its credit bureau data with open banking data essentially. Just because I don't have a mortgage or I'm not on the electoral roll doesn't mean I can't, afford credit payments for certain goods. So, I pay my rent on time or my phone. I'm talking about thin file credit customers here. So I think, they've tapped into the fact that you have this big pool now of real-time account data, which paints a much better picture of a customer's viability and creditworthiness beyond what they have traditionally been providing through their credit bureau data. So I think credit and the US have been doing this for a long time. I think, something about 80% of, home loans are given with open banking data over there. So I think the credit space is really one that, particularly for small businesses and thin file customers, is one that we're going to continue to see grow and grow and grow. And particularly in the UK, where it's one of my biggest bugbears is that we're still open banking and not open finance. It holds the market back quite dramatically. It's a very small amount of a customer's financial portfolio, if you like. And the sooner we can open up to open finance, I think these types of use cases will grow massively.
Just Chris,
Yeah.
why are we slow? What's holding back the development of that?
Sorry, Charles. I was just going to expand
Go
on
ahead.
what you said there a bit.
Oh, please do.
I think the way it works, banking slash open finance is effectively an enabler for, as Lauren mentioned, real-time credit scoring, which is then an enabler for the embedded finance companies to do things such as decide to whether to make a loan or an insurance in real time rather than having to do a credit check with Experian, not necessarily in real time. So it just speeds things up, which, as you say, is why you can walk out of the car showroom with your insurance sorted 5 minutes later rather than having to sort of wait a day or so for the credit check to come back.
Yeah, I'd like to ask just about the development of these sort of open banking and open finance solutions. And as Lauren said, there's tremendous potential, but sometimes the development is a little slow. I mean, Craig, is it now very straightforward to build solutions around open banking? Because it looks as if we've got standardized approaches, standardized protocols. How easy is it now to build open
In
banking
the
solutions?
In the UK, it's still a bit slow because if you want to be a TPP or third party provider, you
Mm.
still need to be onboarded with the FCA, which for very small companies, it's a few £1,000s and you can have to wait months and months and months. So it's not necessarily a quick and easy thing. The way around that is to use either an aggregator like Plaid or Bank as a Service. So going for FCA approval is slow and painful and expensive, whereas the aggregators are a much quicker and easy way of doing it. So it depends on which way route you want to go, really. So it can be quick, but you get less functionality, or it can be slow for sort of deeper functionality.
Okay. And Lauren, you've kind of hinted that sometimes, you said the development of open finance is not as rapid as you'd like it to be. But what is holding back the development of these services? Is it technology? Is it vision? Is it the regulators?
Well, I mean, it varies by country. I mean, in the UK, we have no real open finance agenda, and I'll be very candid. This is my view.
Mm.
Yes, we have the smart data bill, which goes, into the open data world, like way beyond finance. But in terms of incremental change beyond, a payment account or a transactional account, which is what we have in the UK currently, to things like mortgages, to things, like insurance, investments, etc. We don't really have a strong roadmap for getting there. We talk about it on and off, but we kind of get bogged down in smaller kind of detail, which is also valuable, things like variable recurring payments and getting things like that off the ground. That the open finance agenda seems to kind of be pretty stagnant in the UK. Conversely, when we talk about the European Union, who no one would hold up PSD2 as a poster child for success when it comes to open banking, quite the opposite. They're already talking about rectifying some of those mistakes with the Financial Data Access Bill and open finance. So we might have where the UK was doing really well, we've kind of stagnated, and now the Europeans might kind of take over. But that's an extremely ambitious piece of legislation. But um, I think there's a lot of legislative hurdles and regulatory hurdles in the UK. But I think when it comes to, the agile implementation of products in the UK, like we're pretty good
Mm.
compared to other countries. I think, Craig's highlighted a few issues there. Obviously, with the FCA, timeline for access. That's why TPP as a license is becoming so popular. Where fintechs who don't want to go through all the regulatory burden of the FCA will just use another TPP and their license. But also, you have to remember, in the UK, we don't have a centralized approach. Yes, we have the open
Mm.
banking implementation entity, Open Banking Limited, which helps with a lot of the documentation and tries to ease that process for fintechs as much as possible. But it's still bilateral connections, right, between fintechs and banks. If I'm a new
Yeah.
fintech, I have to connect bilaterally with a bank. I have to go through all of their developer portal onboarding, all of their testing. Sometimes their data necessary is not necessarily the best. Um, that's a big burden for relatively small, perhaps small fintech. So we've done really well, but there's still things I think that are challenging for fintechs.
So to push you on that, there's no roadmap. Who should be writing that roadmap? I mean, is that the Bank of England, the FCA? Should someone in government? Because we do know that, I don't want to get political. Maybe
Yeah.
we should, but we currently have a government that's really struggling to connect with the private sector. They just lost Poppy Gustafsson, who was the CEO of Darktrace, who was brought in to advise the government. She said she just couldn't stick being around it and left. Lauren, who would you like to see take the lead on a roadmap? Because it sounds as if one is needed.
I mean, I think that the challenge that we've got is that where it was started out as a competition remedy and the CMA were very good at driving that. Um, I'm not sure the open finance kind of post open banking world would traditionally fall in the CMA world necessarily. So it probably is government, it's probably is FCA. I can't see the Bank of England wading in on this.
The
Um,
direction is Craig. What do you think? I mean, does the UK maybe need someone to take the lead on this, set about a roadmap, knock a few heads together?
Yeah, definitely. A minister for this sort of thing would be great. But actually, to follow up on a slightly earlier point, in terms of, I alluded to it in my introduction, the fact that we led the field, but our standards are very, very strict, whereas
Mm.
other people have learned from our mistakes, such as Brazil and coming on board the US with their FTX 5.3. So I think in some ways the standards are great, but I've read the standards inside out and they can be a bit vague. And sometimes working with TPPs and even banks, it's sometimes a bit difficult to actually turn the standards into a working product, which is also a bit of
Ah.
sometimes.
Just expand on that because people watching this may relate. They may think, well, we've dabbled in this and we found it a menace and we had to seek, consultant to try and talk us through it. I mean, people therefore aren't hallucinating if they're struggling with some of this stuff. Just tell us how vague and why does that make it difficult?
Okay, so there's a couple of examples. So there's the OAuth flows for authorization, and there's also the concept of dynamic client registration, where, as Lauren mentioned, if you're a TPP, you have to onboard with each of the banks. I mean, this will be changed in the future with something called federation, but for now, each TPP has to manually, well, programmatically, but onboard with the bank. But the actual specifications as to what information you need to put in your post request that goes to the bank to onboard to them can be a bit ambiguous, and some of them have particular things turned on, and some of them have particular things turned off. So that's sometimes where consultants have to come in and say, well, actually, you need to do it this way, not that way, and it can be a blocker.
Are people fearful of the regulator? Because we have very energetic and quite talented regulators in the UK, but they do have the eagle eye, and people, rightly or not, are terribly worried about offending the regulator. Now, Craig, you know the situation in Brazil. I don't know the situation in Brazil. Are they slightly more, I'm not going to say Wild West, but slightly more free and easy there?
I would say so, yeah, from my experience of that over there, yeah.
Okay. In a good, yeah,
Yeah,
okay, in a good way. And I mean,
and I
Lauren, you've
think
great
Charles.
experience globally. How do you perceive the UK? I mean, where should we be looking to emulate? Who's moving faster than us and why?
I mean, I think the UK has one of the things the UK has done well, which you could argue it can be a bit embarrassing, but they do the naming and shaming of banks who are underperforming. The way that we articulate our statistics in terms of usage. I mean, sometimes it can be a bit vague and open to interpretation, but in terms of the bank's compliance, if you like, um, we're pretty good at that. In terms of, okay, well, X bank is underperforming this month, or their API response time isn't what it should be. All of that is public domain information. So the banks have their feet to the fire a little bit in terms of how they should be performing. It's very hard, I think, to do, and I'm very reluctant to do it. And it sounds like a cop out, but it actually isn't. To do these kind of like lift and place things, and in as much as we say, oh, everyone should do it like the UK, and I've been in conversations where that has happened. It's very hard to kind of say, all these other countries, we could take that and implement it in the UK because we are quite specific. And I think to Craig's point, which is quite interesting, the downstream effects is when you were talking, Craig, it kind of got my cogs turning about, the onboarding and the OAuth and, and it's all of that complexity makes it
Mm.
really difficult for a fintech to say, and this is when you come down to the kind of regulatory agenda around competition and innovation and stuff. If I'm a fintech and it's going to take me all of this time and effort and money to connect to all of the banks, say, even if they did connect to all of the banks in the UK, which they don't, um, why would I, as a fintech, do all of that kind of technical integration with a bank that has very, very low customer base and low volume, when actually I'll just focus on the top five or whatever. But from a regulatory like competition agenda, that's doing a real disservice to the customers of those banks. So you want to see the downstream impact and the value of what you're developing so that they can say, well, actually, I would have a better offer somewhere else and it'd be better for me to move. But they're never going to get that because the fintechs aren't integrating with them. So we have this kind of a bit of an imbalance, I think, and this is not just a UK issue, by the way. This is, in many markets have this issue. Europe has it significantly. But to kind of your point around, I digress, but who's done it really well? Like I love the Swiss implementation. We would never have that in the UK in a
The
million years.
Swiss, the Swiss,
Yeah,
Switzerland.
Switzerland. So it's not part of obviously the European Union, so it has its own kind of thing going on outside of PSD2. But it's a highly centralized system, very Swiss.
Mm.
All the banks connected on one side, the fintechs connected on the other side. They don't bilaterally connect. Everything is, public domain information. It's commercialized. You can charge for being part of the system, etc. And it works really, really well. They weren't regulated, so it's completely industry driven. The use cases are what the industry wants to see and what's going to provide the most value. So it's a lot around wealth management, as you can imagine in Switzerland. I think that would never work in the UK, but
Okay.
it works really well there. And they took the time to understand the right implementation scenario before going out and starting to build anything. So I always talk about that as one of my favorites.
Beautiful. I'd had no idea. So yeah, so the Swiss, so it's industry led rather than regulator led.
Yeah, there's no regulation there.
There's,
That's cool.
yeah, there's a classic from, I don't know, it
Very
was Plato
submissive.
who said, when the culture of society is good, the laws are
Exactly.
not needed. When the culture is bad, the laws are useless.
Well, yeah, that's
So a
interesting.
very
Yeah,
mature sector like Switzerland can be
yeah.
trusted to look after their own affairs. That's really interesting. And Craig, I know you deal with North America, with the Middle East. Lauren picked out Switzerland there. Is there anywhere else you'd think, tell our viewers, just take a look at this place that you've come across?
Well, I think for me, the US is still very much up in the air. The UAE itself, they have had it mandated, but the banks, the smaller banks and the fintechs are pushing back on it a bit, although the government are kind of whipping them somewhat to say, right, you need to get this done. I think Canada's coming on stream in 2026. They've actually been mandated now, so I'm very excited to see what's happening in Canada. Although, ironically, the population of Canada themselves don't seem to be, they've not had any sort of open banking type implementation before, so it'll be a very new thing for them. So it'll be interesting to see how the fintechs cope with it, how the banks cope with it, and what the speed and the curve of the uptake will be in Canada. So that's the one that I'm watching.
When it comes to uptake, there's some theory that we need to educate the public in open banking, what it means. But my perception is people don't know what it means and also don't really care. They'll use something if they see it works and other people use it. And when it comes to telling them, well, here's the underlying, people just don't give a stuff. Craig, is that too cynical of me? When it comes to adoption, is the
No,
bank maybe excessively interested in trying to educate people when it's actually not needed, that people just want to know if it works or not?
interesting. Anecdotally, I've had a similar thing actually, where people sometimes say to me, "Oh, what do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'm in open banking." And they say, "Well, I've never heard of that." And I say, "Well, have you ever used an app on your phone? It probably uses open banking." And they said, "Oh, yeah, I use financial apps on my phone, but they've never
Hmm.
heard of the actual underlying technology itself." So, as you say, think people don't really care as long as this technology actually works from the front end side of things. They don't really care what's going on underneath.
I think that's
No,
right.
I have
I
a
call
slightly
what, yeah,
different view
Laura.
on
Yep.
this though,
Oh,
because I think I 100% agree that no one needs to know the intricacies of the term open banking or, the plumbing or whatever, but we have consistently educated consumers for a long period of time not to share information. Um, and I think it's it's about what we say, and it doesn't need to be, as detailed and as kind of, industry-led language that we would use amongst each other. But, I think there is an education exercise that is interesting, and actually, Hong Kong did a fantastic job of this because they actually had a communications group within their open banking implementation to say the industry will communicate to their customers in the same way, and we are going to create that narrative and that message that makes sense to customers so they feel safe and secure, interacting with these new kids on the block who they've never heard of before. It's different when it's, your banking app or whatever, but if it's a fintech that you've never heard of and that is, a B2C fintech who's trying to, go through a customer acquisition process, I think the communication is quite important actually.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't need to talk about, OAuth 2 and FAPI and all that kind of stuff, right? But I think there is a message there.
Okay, I'd like just, we've got 5 minutes left, just to touch on two further subjects. One of which is education. If people work in the banking industry or in fintech, how they can become better acquainted with the technologies behind open banking and whether they actually need to. And also, I'd just like to ask about AI, what impacts that making, whether, vibe coding, creation of open banking apps, whether that's actually a thing yet. Lauren, can I just ask you, if people want to learn more about open banking, what do you recommend to them? Do they need to get into the nitty gritty of OAuth and FAPI and stuff like that?
Probably not. I mean, it depends who they are. I mean, I would love to see, the amount of conversations I have with different people in banks, even who aren't on necessarily the retail banking side, but this will come to them eventually. They'll be maybe on the investment side of the house or the capital market side. There's more internal organization within banks. There's no reason why there shouldn't be like more of an open finance team like within
Hmm.
banks. But I do think, that we talk about this all the time. It's everywhere. There is so much literature out there now. I think some of the literature can be a bit confusing and assumes a level of knowledge that not everyone has. So I do think it's upon ourselves to kind of get over this acronym kind of soup
Hmm.
that we seem to have in open banking these days. But yeah, I think there's lots of literature out there now.
And Craig, what do you recommend for people who want to improve their knowledge of open banking?
so in my experience, I tend to be sort of boots on the ground. I often work with development teams and architects who are actually building this out end to end. And as I say, one of the problems has been the vagueness of the specifications. But you mentioned vibe coding.
Yes.
For small snippets of code, in my experience, things like vibe coding and cursor and such like are actually quite good for producing boilerplate code, shall we say?
Yeah.
So researching some of these specs. AI is not perfect in terms of getting all the answers, but yeah, in terms of bootstrapping, developing vibe coding and Cursor and Claude and such like are actually quite useful tools for getting the sort of nuts and bolts of any new implementation, be it for a bank or a TPP going.
Are your clients comfortable with that though? I don't know what where we're at now with because I'm sure
Yeah,
pretty much
but
everyone involved in coding is playing around with these tools. But when it actually
I
comes to
do
actually implementing it, bank tier one bank, what their policies are about vibe coding. What have you seen, Craig?
I do school them that for very small snippets of code, just literally a couple of functions here, maybe some plumbing there, it's fine. But for anything larger than a few hundred lines of code or architecture, not so good.
Okay, that's good. Lauren, what do you think? I mean, you're clearly someone who really loves the creative side of finance and open banking. How much has AI changed organizations' ability to, whip up a minimum viable product?
I think we're seeing a lot more of it, and I think it's also like how is it being used like in earnest? And this is where I think Asia is so fantastic to watch. I find banking apps largely very boring.
Hmm.
You don't really, especially like in the UK. No offense to the UK banks, but
Yeah.
they're largely pretty static and kind of dry. And then you go to kind of Asia, they're not just using AI as a kind of minimum viable product, they're using it as their core, their core kind of app functionality is built off of this stuff. And it's amazing to watch. And I'm like, I want that banking app. Why can't I have that banking app? And it's like, why, the UK banks and European banks need to be looking at integrating it in a far more sophisticated way, on top of, like we've mentioned, open finance and data analytics and the like, to create an actually really valuable experience. And this particular bank who in Singapore has not done it to acquire new customers. They've done it to keep their existing customers. So they're doing it to keep their customers happy, and it's working.
Okay, again, Singapore. It's a regular on FinTech Talk. People go, you must go and take a look at what's going in Singapore. There's this, bank. There's this new startup. There's a neobank. They're doing something incredible.
There's no
Wonderful.
reason why our banks in the UK cannot do that. There's some things I think in countries like Singapore, Switzerland, for example, that are very difficult to replicate because of the market dynamics. That is not one of them. The UK banks can easily create banking apps like that.
Okay, I just got to ask. I mean, anything in Africa? What's going on in Africa? I've not prepped you with this question, but
That's a
it's
good
yeah.
question.
I
Uh,
mean, open banking is pretty nascent. There's
Hmm.
a few pockets of activity happening. We know South Africa is moving. Kenya will be moving. A couple of the sub-Saharan African countries are also looking at it. But I mean, Craig, you might have a different view, but we're not seeing any wholesale implementations yet.
I've not really had much experience in the African banking. The only thing I would say is it's helping the unbanked become banked because, as we know, most people have smartphones now. So it's a good way of enabling banking with micropayments and such like for those who wouldn't normally have access to any financial services.
Okay, and just to finish, I'd just like to just hear your view for the future. I mean, Craig, you're obviously really excited to work in open banking, even though your friends may not know exactly what it is you do. But what is it? Why is this industry so exciting? Where's it going?
That's a good question. I think, as Lauren says, expanding it into open finance is a great thing. But for me, I'm kind of more a bit of a back-end architecture type dev guy. So I love the fact that this is the scaffolding or the plumbing that enables all these amazing apps. I mean, the actual apps themselves, as I say, a bit nerdy myself, but seeing these things like the AI concierge embedded finance apps come on board and think, oh, I actually helped build the plumbing and the scaffolding for that is very exciting for me.
And Lauren, you talked about that need for a roadmap and the potential for this to really change finance and put consumers back into control of their data. What's going to be exciting for you over the next 5 years?
What I would like to see, I'm going to flip it slightly, Charles. Say what I would like to see, whether it will happen or not, will remain to be seen. But I'd love to see, in so many other areas in financial services, we get together internationally and talk about whether it's the implementation of ISO 2082, whether it's AI regulatory frameworks. But for some reason, open finance, open banking, open finance doesn't get the same airtime, if you like. We
Hmm.
don't. I'd love to see like an open finance council at a global level where we can share, like properly share best practice and properly share how we should be implementing this stuff as an industry and what we need to be asking of our regulators. Um, I think, that's where I would like to see the industry go, much more international coordination.
Global Open Finance Council. Love it. Okay, well, guys, thank you so much for your contributions. That's been a crash course and an education for me, and I hope for all the people watching. I've learned, yep, Switzerland is the place to look at. for when self-organizing, very well-behaved banks and fintechs like to come together to make the world a better place. And yeah, Brazil too. One of those countries that, in the popular mind, famous for tourism and football, but has just so many wonderful banking, aerospace, manufacturing industries. Turns out that's another great place to be looking at. So yeah, Craig, Lauren, thank you for joining us, and to everyone else, thank you for joining us here at FinTech Talk.